And of course, we're going to be discussing today your book, The Rise and Fall of Big Meech and the Black Mafia Family. So tell us about the book.
Well, it just came out in March, early March, and I've been working on it for quite a while. It actually came from, or kind of was born out of a series of newspaper articles that I wrote. Got interested in these guys because they were very, very active in Atlanta, both in the drug game and in the hip-hop scene. So it was this interesting convergence of two worlds.
You know, it's so funny is because, well, I mean, you know, you always heard stories about the Black Mafia family being linked to certain people such as Jacob the Jeweler, Jeezy, Diddy, Fabolous. But, you know, it wasn't like it was such a secret that, you know, their whole thing was going on.
No, they were very obvious about it. You know, and sort of one of the things I get into in the book is how Big Meech, one of the kingpins of the crew, sort of pretty much stopped, like he couldn't get caught.
Yeah, and so for the listeners that might not know what's happening, you might have seen the, you know, people from the Black Mafia family, such as Blue Da Vinci on the Come Up DVDs, a lot of different hip hop DVDs,
yeah.
The Raw Report.
Yeah.
So you actually went in and interviewed Big Meech?
I did, yes.
And what is this guy saying? Because he was locked up now for 30 years, right?
Yes, he got a 30-year prison sentence. He's been locked up since 2005, so he's 5 years into it at this point. You know, just a nice guy, very charismatic. You can see why so many people kind of revered him.
And of course, Big Meech and also his brother, Southwest T, both started their business in Detroit by selling $50 bags of crack cocaine. Is that true?
That's true, yeah. They were pretty much, you know, street-level dealers in their teenage years in Southwest Detroit, and kind of grew that from that sort of level into a $270 million, 500-man workforce enterprise, empire, really.
And is it true also that by the time charges were filed, the government had 900 pages of typed transcripts of wiretapped conversations from Terry's phone?
Many. You know, but Meech was not on those wiretaps. They were on other members of the organization, his brother to some extent, and then some other players. But they, you know, we're talking thousands and thousands of pages of court documents, some of them affidavits from witnesses, but very few of those really lining up against Big Meech. He was right in his estimation that people would not want to snitch on him, basically.
Because they were scared for their life. So I was wondering, towards the end of this whole situation when charges were filed, the two brothers were no longer doing business together, right? Because wasn't it Terry that moved to L.A. and Meech stayed in Atlanta?
They worked in tandem for a long time. And then there was a time when they did split that they had the same, or at least authorities believe they still had the same cocaine source. It was like some Mexican cartels getting straight Colombian cocaine and just bringing it over to California. So although they had the same source, they had totally separate and distinct crews at that point. Now there's evidence that when they were indicted that the feds didn't really realize how strong that split was, so they had assumed that a lot of the evidence against Terry equated to evidence against Meech, and that might not have been the reality.
So let me ask you then, if they had all these wiretap conversations from Terry, did they possibly use any of that, you know, and say to Terry, if you tell us about what Meech is doing, we can get him locked up too and give you any less time? Or
according to Meech, they did go to Terry and give him that deal.
Oh, okay.
His brother.
They each got 30 years though, right?
Well, Terry turned them down on that deal. He wasn't going to turn, even though he and his brother had kind of parted ways and had some sort of, you know, disagreements about things. He wasn't going to turn on his brother.
Okay, so now, you know, because we've heard so much during the trials where, you know, Jeezy had to get on the stand.
No, Jeezy did not get on the stand.
So he didn't get on the stand.
No. They talked about him a lot, but you know, keep in mind, Meech and Terry pleaded guilty, so there wasn't a trial. There were some other BMF members that did go on trial, and in their court cases, there was a lot of talk about sort of the legitimate side of BMF with their involvement with rappers like Blue Da Vinci and Young Jeezy, but not, they didn't call them to the stand.
From what I read, and maybe this is wrong, originally they wanted to use Jeezy, you know, to prove that they had legitimate businesses going on, but then it kind of backfired on them because Jeezy's whole image is a cocaine dealer?
Well, yeah, what happened was there was a BMF third in command, a guy named Fleming Ill Daniels. He was on trial at the federal courthouse in Atlanta, and the defense kept talking about, you know, BMF is not merely a drug organization. It's also a hip-hop promotion company, which is true, or was true at least. And so they were trying to say that this guy, Ill, wasn't, tied to the illegal BMF. He was tied to the legal BMF. And so they brought up Jeezy's name a bunch as far as a big star that BMF had some involvement with. Now, he wasn't, signed to their label or anything, but they threw parties and created a bunch of buzz around Jeezy. Now, then the other side, the prosecution brings up evidence, and it wasn't Jeezy that came to the stand. It was a guy who was a convicted murderer, so not, by some accounts the most reliable witness, but he testified that BMF had, sold cocaine to young Jeezy, that he had picked up cocaine from one of the stash houses.
No, that's crazy right there.
Yeah.
Now, Jacob the jeweler is now in prison, and from what I understand, he's in prison for allegedly cleaning drug money through his business.
Well, he was charged with money laundering, but he pleaded to a lesser charge. What happened was the feds went in and talked to him about some medallions and other sort of jewelry that they had confiscated during a traffic stop, and they had taken it from Terry, but Terry had said it belonged to somebody else. Jacob the jeweler had said, he was like, oh, yeah, this didn't belong to Terry. I don't even really know that guy. I sold this to this other guy. He was lying because the feds had evidence that, in fact, he had many dealings and didn't really report the, $10,000+ that Terry was spending at any given time, which is against federal law. So they charged him with money laundering, but ultimately it was like I'm going to get the charge wrong, but something like lying to federal investigators or misleading federal investigators.
Now, I also read that Diddy's name, he seems to keep coming up with the Black Mafia family. What did Diddy have to do with it?
Well, there's lots of evidence that he at the very least, partied a lot with these guys, with Terry and Meech in particular. Meech has talked at length about his friendship with Diddy. One thing that happened was that they got involved. Meech was charged with but never indicted for a murder in Atlanta that occurred behind one of the big clubs here, Club Chaos, and the person killed, it was a double homicide, and one of the guys was Wolf, who used to be Diddy's bodyguard back in the day and had been involved in some other high-profile shootings that involved Sean Combs in New York, the one that Shyne actually went to prison for.
Wow, it's so funny how it's like everything's connecting here.
Right. And then another, so the guy who later replaced Wolf, a guy named Paul Buford, was actually indicted along with the Flannery brothers for some drug trafficking offenses. So that's another really close connection to Sean Combs, was this other guy who was. And then Combs' cousin was also indicted. He pleaded guilty as well. So there was a lot of people right around in Sean Combs' sort of immediate vicinity that wound up getting put in jail because of this stuff.
Now, Fabolous' name has also been brought up repeatedly with the Black Mafia family. Is it only for making music with Blue Da Vinci?
Exclusively. I mean, and he shows up in videos and talking about BMF as his good buddies and shout outs to Big Meech and that kind of thing. But he was never accused of any wrongdoing in relation to BMF. He was at the scene of a stabbing in Atlanta at Sean Combs' restaurant. Justin's in Midtown.
Okay.
And two of the people who were stabbed were, weirdly enough, Bobby Brown's nephews. So it was a weird convergence of a bunch of things. And Fabolous was there and was allegedly in the getaway car with the person who did the stabbings.
So you spent 4 years researching this whole situation. You have the book that's in stores now, The Rise and Fall of Big Meech and the Black Mafia Family. And let me ask you a question. Is the Black Mafia, do they still exist?
They're mostly dismantled, at least at the top. Now you have these little more, coming up from the street-level groups that are claiming BMF allegiance, but, not so much in Atlanta. That's mostly in Detroit, and it makes sense that it is in Detroit because that's where the Flannerys were born and sort of birthed the organization. So they actually were at the street level at some point there, whereas in the other cities they operated in, they came in at, top-level distributor status. So, the fact that there's this sort of buzz about BMF on the street level in Detroit might make some sense. So.
Mara Shalhoup, and the book is called The Rise and Fall of Big Meech and the Black Mafia Family, in stores now. Go pick it up. This is a very interesting book right here. Very interesting.